Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local. Okay, let's move on to the rise, hidden gems, and the rise of forums and the decline of big social. So Joy Hawkins of Sterling Sky tweeted about how her I think it was the local search forum, right? She's talking about the local search forum. This is the forum that she owns where there's a lot of conversation about particular issues and problems, questions with local search, how it's seeing, massive traffic spike. And this is sort of in the larger context of Google's so-called hidden gems. I don't want to call it a strategy exactly, but that's, I guess, what it is. The desire to surface more user-generated content, more human content. Reddit is the leading example of that, but Quora and other forums and other sort of social sites where people are having conversations on topics that are of interest. And so we're seeing more in YouTube and TikTok, the sort of video side of that too. We're seeing more of that human-created content sort of showing up. And partly this is in response to demand, user behavior, as people were searching for Reddit responses to their queries. And also partly it's an anti-AI content strategy, as more and more content is now being partly or almost entirely generated by ChatGPT and its progeny. And so this is a good development on the one hand, in the sense that it may get people to information more quickly, but it carries risks, as the hours update indicates, right? So Google says we're going to reward 24/7 businesses, and everybody suddenly is 24/7. Similarly, the incentives now are to get into these forums and to generate content that's going to expose them. With good moderation, it's harder to spam those forums, but Yahoo Answers, which doesn't exist anymore, was one of those earlier examples. All the sort of answer sites, those were often full of spam. Quora is full of spam. So to what extent, this is rhetorical for the moment, are we going to see more of that? And then the other piece of this is, I also want to talk about TikTok as a search engine, but the other piece of this is, Mike, which you brought up, is the decline of so-called big social, which is like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, which are still have a lot of users engaged with them, but the level of engagement has declined, definitely. So what do you guys think about these things?
My thought is that I have long been thinking about the decline of Twitter, the decline of Facebook, at least 18 months. And for some types of businesses, a forum or a more personal blog with comments makes sense again. And it has for the last year and a half, 2 years, that certain types of businesses would be better served by removing themselves from unowned spaces like Facebook, which constantly is changing the rules deleteriously to business, and creating their own spaces. Now, this isn't every business, but I do think this idea of your own community makes sense. And now the own community may be at Reddit, it may be at a local search forum, it may be on your own blog, but I think businesses from a marketing point of view need to consider this shift and integrate it in a positive way. I mean, obviously there's always this chance of abuse and overuse and whatever, but I do think that it's a good, in that sense, I think it's a good opportunity to review your social strategy and exit the likes of companies like Facebook, where you've never owned your presence and you never will.
I guess I would say it's Google offloading quality rating to a different source in terms of the folks like Joy, Joy's probably not personally moderating the local search forum, but her team moderating that content. Google's able to then trust that a little bit more than someone who's just putting out a AI generated tome on how to rank in local search for whatever query. So I think it's that there's that piece of it. I guess I would suggest that, and Greg, you brought this up a little bit with Reddit. Like, I don't think this is going to benefit all forums. I do think that there's sort of this nexus of how good of a brand is the forum, what's its track record, and that, yes, unfortunately, sites like Quora, which are spam ridden, are still going to rank everywhere and probably have increased their rankings as a result. But by and large, like, I don't think you're just going to be able to spin up your own forum and populate it with a bunch of bots who are asking questions and expect to see a major impact.
Right. So this is a sort of a response to what Mike just said. Is if you're a small or medium-sized business, the proposition of creating your own community. Now you can do this in different ways, but the idea of creating a community, a forum, or something like that is going to be really challenging, I think. Wouldn't you say? I mean, there are 2 points. One is sort of the fragmentation of social, right? So I mean, we're going from a small number of sites that had all the audience to more sites that have smaller audiences, and it creates more of a burden on marketers. Like, where do you put your content? Barry Schwartz is on every single social site, but what he's doing is he's reposting the same content, the identical content, basically, on those places. But most normal people and businesses can't do that. They don't have the time to do that. So it's this fragmentation of social, and then the challenge of creating your own community. I mean, people don't have time to join 10 different communities. And then your point earlier, David, in previous podcasts about you're not going to rank, if this is at the blog point, this is about a blog, blogging again. If you're a primary care physician, you're not going to rank for, diabetes, or what are the signs of diabetes or something like that. So this complicates the idea of what you're saying, Mike, of just build it yourself, So how would you respond?
I'm not saying everybody should build it themselves.
Yeah, it depends on the business.
I just think
type
that there are businesses where it makes sense. Like
exactly.
Our business, it has made sense to me to engage community more directly in our writing so that our news and analysis can get additional sort of input and visibility. Do I think it's right for everybody? No, absolutely not. But blogging's never been right for everybody. I mean, if you're, most people shouldn't have done it in the first place.
But it was generic SEO advice for a long time.
It's terrible SEO advice for most businesses. Like Greg, your point about the endocrinologist starting their own blog, absolutely. It's really unless that endocrinologist is very well known already and can attract their own audience, that's not the first place I would be placing content. I would be spending time in whatever the main forum for people with diabetes is, like diabetes.org. If they have a forum, go hang out there and help people with their questions. That's how you're going to build thought leadership and credibility and, get referrals and all that kind of stuff. Posting content in areas where your community hangs out has always been a good strategy. And to Mike's point, it's actually way better to do that in a forum that might get additional exposure in Google as opposed to a private Facebook group or some other walled garden social media property.
Well, does this implicate your review strategy? Does this implicate your review strategy? Most businesses do not respond to reviews on Yelp, on Google, on whatever, TripAdvisor, wherever the reviews exist. Most businesses are not responding. It's a minority of businesses. Is this part of the sort of nouveau community strategy that you're advocating? Invest more time in responding to reviews.
I would absolutely invest more time in responding to reviews than in writing blog posts. Yes. I think it's much more important for 2 reasons. Number one, that's already a customer or a potential customer, and you want to either deepen the relationship if it's a positive review or potentially save the relationship if it's a negative review. So given how difficult it is to attract new customers, absolutely, that's time well spent. And secondly, your responses are going to be far more visible in terms of people seeing them in a Google business profile, maybe in a Yelp profile, than any piece of content that you put on your own website. I mean, we know the impressions of GBP knowledge panels far exceeds the impressions of a given individual piece of content on a typical small business website. So I just think from an eyeball standpoint and also from that relationship standpoint I mentioned earlier, I absolutely think that I would put review responses ahead of creating a bunch of your own content.
But you've pointed out in the past, and this was helpful to me, that some content siloed, not sort of in a date order on a website, makes sense, as does good content that you publish at some other more visible site, right?
Correct.
So
right.
this idea of shifting your content strategy away from, at least for this endocrinologist, away from their blog, either towards internal, high quality internal content,
Yeah.
so, in the content silo that it's relevant to, and also externally at a relevant site. Like if you can get published on the endocrinology review, that's great.
Right.
Content.
Right. And it really depends. I mean, there's a sort of arc of business size and essentially domain authority in terms of when it becomes useful to publish your own content, right? But if you're starting from scratch and you have, 3 directory links, Google's just not going to rank your own content very well. Once you've got a little bit more of a link footprint and a little bit stronger of a website, publishing your own content in some of these deeper topical areas that relate to your business may pay dividends. But Greg, if you're talking about a fairly new, fairly small business, like you've got to be putting your content on other sources, whether that's industry journals, like Mike was just saying, whether that's responding to Google reviews, whether that's participating in fora, like that's all a better use of your time than trying to create one blog post a month, which frankly is really hard for most businesses as well. They don't know that you can't just sit them in front of a keyboard and ask them to write a blog post.
But not with new AI content creation tools.
But it's, in my experience, anyway, working with small businesses, if you ask them a direct question, they're very good at giving a well thought through response that uses their expertise, which is a lot of times what is happening in forums. So I can, I do think it's a little bit more of a natural place to kind of put your energy. And frankly, like your Barry Schwartz example, like, yes, you can also publish that same Q&A on your own content and change the words a little bit with something like AI. And there you're getting a 2 for the same amount of effort.
Well, Darren Shaw, when we had Darren and Joy on to talk about how they were using AI a few weeks ago, talked about how they now have started interviewing their customers to get that expertise out, and then their internal people are creating content using that as the basis and some AI tool support. So that's a good strategy. We're sort of running a little bit long today, but one of the final things that I want to say that's relevant to this story is this Adobe TikTok survey. So they surveyed a bunch of people, consumers, about how they were using TikTok as a search engine. Not, are you just using TikTok? How much time do you spend on TikTok? But explicitly as a search engine. And it was very interesting. I won't summarize all the results. I wrote about them earlier this week, but people are using TikTok very self-consciously as a search engine, partly to get that human, more authentic, more authoritative, presumably, content. Recipes was the number one category, interestingly, that people were using it for. They were using it for music and other things.
Interesting there, right? The dialectic of recipes in Google and copyright law created this morass of terrible recipe articles on the web that you largely can't use, right? And so people find an alternative, which is TikTok. Makes sense.
Well, it's just a lot more efficient. I mean, the paradox is that Google has, if you do some search for white bean soup or chicken tikka masala or some other recipe, there are just bazillions of results, and you can't really differentiate them because they all are sort of relatively rated around the same amount, and it's very frustrating and difficult to find a good recipe there. So if you do,
it's one of the few subscriptions I pay for, which is Cooks Illustrated, American Test Kitchen,
right?
So that I can have direct access to their recipes and their testing of it, so I can.
It's just like the Wirecutter. It's just like the Wirecutter.
Well,
it's just
better
much more
than the
efficient.
Wirecutter because it's not as compromised.
It's different than the Wirecutter as well because the Wirecutter is horizontal, and I think that this speaks to a point you've made many times, Greg, which is that there is a considerable opportunity with the new large language model thing to build a really strong, very deep vertical search engine that is just way better than anything Google's delivering. And so I wouldn't be surprised if, I'm not saying Cooks Illustrated is not forward thinking, but some forward thinking food entity, commercial entity, builds something like this that becomes a real destination for people craving great recipes. I think that's
well. I use the New York Times cooking app, which I think is a great app. But you can burn out on their recipes. I mean, at a certain point,
right.
you got to go outside. But recipe blogs in particular are almost unusable on a mobile device because they're so riddled. It's like
you have to write a bunch of content that no one wants to read in order to rank.
Well, you're writing that content to create more ad impressions, right? You have to scroll and scroll and scroll. I mean, now a lot of them have jumped to recipe. But anyway, the point is that people are frustrated with the clutter and want more authentic content, want more efficient. I think efficiency is a hidden user experience need here, and Google is trying to respond to that with the hidden gems strategy and with these forums. We'll see how it plays out. So ends another exciting episode of the Near Memo, and as always, we'll be back next time with more exciting adventures.
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.